Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, America's Changing and Embattled Election System. I am Kate Connors, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the participant interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop on the right side of your screen. Due to the number of people participating in this webinar, you will not see the names of the others attending. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to the presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel, also on the right side of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A portions of this presentation. We'll try to address as many of your questions as we can during this webinar. Additionally, at the beginning of the webinar, we will ask for your participation in 3 polls. As these polls appear, you will be asked to make a selection and hit submit. Once the polls are closed, I'll share the results with you. I'd like to introduce Doug Chapin. Doug has worked in the field of elections for more than 25 years. He is the founder of the popular online news site, electiononline.org. And during more than a decade at the Pew Charitable Trust, he and his team worked with state and local election officials across America on numerous projects dedicated to improving the nation's election system, including the Voting Information Project, the Elections Performance Index, and federal and state laws that reduced barriers to the ballot for military and overseas voters. He has a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton University, a master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center. Doug is the director of the University of Minnesota's Certificate in Election Administration at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And now I'll hand it over to Doug.
Thank you very much, Kate. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. As Kate mentioned, I just want to start today's session with a quick poll. Usually when you get a group of people together, you do an icebreaker. That's a little bit more difficult when you don't have everybody in the same place. But just want to ask everybody 3 quick questions to kind of get a sense of the room. The first one is, which of these do you think is the greatest threat to America's election system? Low turnout, disenfranchisement, fraud, hacking, or none of these? And the poll says that we have 5 minutes, but I think we'll try and do this in 45 seconds tops. So go ahead and click on your response. These are all anonymized, so don't worry that you will be tagged with a specific response. Okay, Kate, let's go ahead and close that poll. All right. Our second question, which level of government do you think is best positioned to run American elections, federal, state, or local? Okay, Kate, let's close this one. And then finally, just get everybody to tell us a little bit about who you are. If you would, please check any of these that apply, whether you're an elected official, or an election administrator, somebody working in an elections office, a student, or a journalist, blogger, media professional. And then don't forget, as Kate mentioned, that you will have opportunities to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try and leave lots of information, lots of time at the end for those questions to be answered. Okay, let's see. Just get a quick peek of the results on the polls. Can you put those up for me, Kate? All right. Well, we're still working on those results. We will continue with the presentation. So I guess the first thing I want to do before we get into today's subject is I would like to introduce and tell folks about the Certificate in Election Administration here at the University of Minnesota. Working with the Humphrey School, which is one of the nation's leaders in public administration education in the nation, partnered with folks here to bring that same mission to the field of election administration. And our mission is quite simple. We seek to identify, recruit, and train the next generation of election officials in America. We have three audiences for the program. The first, and I know there are several of you on here today, current election officials who are seeking either to broaden or deepen your knowledge of the field. The field is intensely practical, and lots of people have jurisdiction-specific or office-specific knowledge based on their work. And even though people do their work professionally, there isn't necessarily a profession. What we seek to do is bring practitioners together in a profession of election administration. By the same token, we're also looking to encourage and entice students interested in public administration to specialize in election administration. There's a lot exciting going on in the field right now, and to the extent that we can find people who are looking to choose a career or explore a career, give them opportunities to choose and explore the field of election administration. And then finally, we also look to offer opportunities to people in other fields who are looking to gain entry into election administration. As many of you know, the field has become increasingly varied. It's not a simple, straightforward job if it ever were, but we now have lots of new professionals, whether they are lawyers or journalists, IT professionals, designers, community organizers, folks who have a vested interest in American elections and American democracy, but who also want to learn more about how the process actually works. Also happy to announce, and this is relatively new, that while the program has previously been a master's level certificate, based on feedback from the field and conversations I've had with folks across the country, we now offer an undergraduate certificate as well. So if you are someone in the field or interested in elections who for whatever reason doesn't have a bachelor's degree, there are opportunities to earn an undergraduate level certificate backed by the Regents of the University of Minnesota in the field of election administration. And we'll talk a little bit more about the application process and other details at the end of the webinar. These are the courses that we currently offer. We have, this fall, we'll be offering my course on a survey and election administration, which looks at a variety of issues and the underlying themes, like central versus local control, access versus integrity, fairness versus finality, and how it plays out in a variety of different areas. My colleague Larry Jacobs offers a course in strategic management of election administration, which is an election-specific version of the how to be a public administrator in an increasingly political world. I'll also be offering a new course this fall, sequenced immediately after Larry's course on voter outreach, which is intended to help election officials understand the various traditionally underrepresented communities that election officials seek to serve, and the different techniques and tools that can be used to increase participation in those communities. Also this spring, we'll be offering a course on elections and the law, which is an introduction to the legal process with some election-themed content. Dana Chisnell and Whitney Quesenberry will once again be doing their first in the nation online course in election design, where students learn basic design techniques and then how to apply them in election-specific projects. Tammy Patrick will be once again offering her data analysis in election administration course. Tammy is one of the leading data geeks in the election field and has really put together a nice course showing students where the data comes from, how it can use it, and what kind of conclusions you can draw. And then at the end, when students are ready to get their certificate, I run what's known as a capstone seminar, where students, either alone or in groups, work with a real-world client on a real-world election problem, study it, and make recommendations and a presentation to the election official. We're also still developing a variety of courses. Not surprisingly, we're looking to put one together on cybersecurity for elections, as well as other maybe less newsworthy but no less important topics like budgeting and financial management, organizational management, and communications. So let's go ahead and jump into today's topic. I think it's fair to say that the 2016 election was one of the more interesting elections that we've had in many years. Obviously, anytime you have a national presidential election, it's going to stir up strong emotions and strong positions on all sides of the aisle. But I think it's fair to say that 2016 was extraordinary in lots of ways. The first, and I know the election officials on the call will certainly remember this, is that there were lots of allegations before Election Day about potential rigging of election results. There was concern of one candidate, the candidate who ultimately became president, that somehow the election system would be rigged against him, and that there should be deep suspicion of the process as a result, leading election officials really on both sides of the aisle across the country to push back on the integrity of the election system. We also had reports both before and after Election Day of hacking attempts of state systems. There were early unconfirmed reports. 2 states went offline briefly because of reports of hacking, and then, as you all know, the hacking reports and the information about who may have been behind them have only deepened since Election Day. After Election Day, not only were there confirmation that there were hacking attempts on American electoral systems, but increasing evidence that there was involvement by a foreign entity thought to be Russia in an attempt to compromise or at least have some kind of impact on the 2016 election. So what happened in response? And this is part of what has been extraordinary since Election Day 2016. The first is that the outgoing Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, a man named Jay Johnson, designated the nation's election system as, quote, critical infrastructure. And what that means is that it gives a heightened level of protection and access to federal assets for state election systems across the country. Again, we've learned more and more about not just the scope of the attempts to hack American electoral systems, but also about who might have been behind those hacking attempts, with the resulting focus on what we can do to not just detect, but harden and prevent against those attacks in the future. And then third, as most of you know, the president-elect originally tweeted about concerns about voter fraud, and then has actually convened a federal presidential advisory commission on election integrity, which just began its work yesterday. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So let's talk for a little bit about critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure, which was originally designated by the outgoing Department of Homeland Security, but has been continued by the new Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Kelly, makes state election officials subject to a critical infrastructure designation, which gives them, at least in theory, access to federal cybersecurity tools and other resources of both DHS and other players in the cybersecurity field. This was not without controversy. There was some pushback both after Election Day and before Inauguration Day about critical infrastructure, partly because of concerns of federal incursion into state election administration, but also because of some confusion and uncertainty about what exactly the critical infrastructure designation meant. And as the process has continued, it's become increasingly clear that uncertainty continues. While there is at least a little more detail about the kinds of resources that DHS is making available to election officials across the country, it isn't entirely clear to whom those are being made available. At a recent meeting of the National Association of Secretaries of State in Indianapolis, there was a briefing by Homeland Security to state election officials, and my understanding is that many of the officials in the room were surprised to hear that people in their states had been in contact with DHS even though they knew nothing about it. And so as critical infrastructure continues, as DHS role continues to clarify, many states are still seeking more answers about what exactly DHS can do for them, what DHS might do to them, and whether or not they will know what's happening as the process continues. I want to highlight, I think, an excellent resource for folks out there who may be interested in learning a little bit more about critical infrastructure. The Election Assistance Commission's CI Scoop blog, written by Mark Listus, has several really good posts on the various entities involved, whether they're interstate advisory commissions, multi-state advisory commissions, informal advisory commissions, and the like. But if you want to learn the lingo in critical infrastructure so that as folks in your state and other states begin to talk about what's happening with critical infrastructure, that's an excellent place to start. Let me pause right there through the very low-tech but no less informative pen and paper method. We have results from the initial poll. The majority of you believe that disenfranchisement is the greatest threat to the American electoral system. We have a pretty clear split in the group on whether or not the federal government or state governments are the best levels of government to manage American elections. And it looks like we have a nice mix of folks across the various backgrounds and professions in the audience today. So moving on to our second topic, and that is hacking. In the weeks and months following the 2016 election, we have seen large numbers of reports about the hacking, but some uncertainty and varying reports about how many states were hit and how. Depending on who you talk to, it can be as few as 21, it can be as many as 37, but many of the states which were supposedly hacked as part of the 37 say that is news to them. We do know for a fact that there were a non-zero number of states that were subject to hacking attacks, mostly through their online voter registration databases or other public-facing websites. What we don't know is exactly how many states were involved or what exactly was attacked in each one of those, and we're hoping to learn more about that in the months to come. A common theme that we are increasingly seeing, not just in the attacks on election systems, but also on the other various hacking attacks we saw against the DNC and other entities in the run-up to election, is the prominent role of so-called phishing attacks. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, number one, you should be, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But phishing attacks are those emails you get that look like they are from someone you should be able to trust, but in actuality are not someone you should be able to trust. They are no longer as simplistic or easily spotted as that Nigerian prince with access to millions of dollars that he just needs to launder through your bank account. They can now take the form of an email that looks like it's from your bank or from a social media provider or even a coworker or a boss. And every single one of these is designed to get you to give personally identifiable information, usually your username and password, but maybe something else. And increasingly, these are being used to let bad guys essentially in the back door where they can then access and take information that lives on your various systems. And as we now know, some intrusions are worse than others. There were some states that just had a large number of suspicious hits to their sites and attempts to penetrate, but in a couple of states, Illinois being one of them, tens of thousands of records were supposedly downloaded from the state election website, leading that site and one in Arizona to be shut down briefly in the run-up to 2016. So we know that the threat is real and that these aren't necessarily just nuisance attacks. While we don't yet know why the attacks were made or what exactly the attackers intended to do with the information, we now know that it's a fact that such attacks are happening with increasing regularity across the country. So what are the takeaways from the news about hacking and the increasing concern about security of online election information? I mean, number one is that cybersecurity is no longer a nice to do or a should do. It is a must do. It is a job critical aspect for election officials at every level of government. And in fact, I think a lot of the frustration you're seeing from states and localities right now is because they recognize that cybersecurity is important, but they don't feel like they're being given enough information or access to resources to do that job properly. I think another takeaway is that election offices need to engage in what's known as threat modeling. I know it can be difficult. Some people are better than others at imagining the worst and preparing for it, but in many ways, that's exactly what threat modeling requires you to do. It requires you almost to spy on yourself and identify where you are weakest and then look for ways to protect yourself. Those of you who have either been in the military or worked with folks in the military know this is OPSEC, or operational security. But for those of you who don't think at that level or are unfamiliar with threat modeling, I found an article recently that really did a nice job of helping normal, maybe more trusting folks like you and me to think about threat modeling, and that involves these questions. Who am I and what am I doing here? What's the job that I'm doing? Who out there might want to mess with me and how? And then how much can I stand to do about it? And you can make anything more secure, but it usually requires increasing amounts of time and treasure and sometimes tears. But then the most important is rinse and repeat. Building a threat model is not a one-time deal. As you improve your security, you create either new opportunities or you force an attacker to find another way in. And so knowing where you are weakest, why you are concerned about being attacked, and finding ways to close those doors and lock those windows is increasingly important. This point is one that I think is not necessarily being made, and one that I want to impress upon everybody here and hopefully get you to mention to your colleagues in the election field. I think the most vulnerable assets in American democracy right now are not votes, but voters. There's been a lot of focus in the post-election period about the possibility of an outside entity, whether it's a foreign nation or some other bad actor, somehow changing election totals and making it so that candidate B won when candidate A should have won. And while that needs to be a focus, and election officials can and do worry about that, I think the more immediate threat, and one that we all need to take seriously, is the threat to voters, and in particular their personally identifiable information that's available online. Just as a bank or an online retailer or anyone who takes in personally identifiable information has to take care with that data, I think election officials and folks who care about them need to do the same. In the average election record, the average voter record, there is a bunch of information that in the wrong hands could be used to do financial or other harm to voters. All are part of a Social Security number, name and address, other information. And so just as banks and online retailers and others guard their client data as zealously as they can, I think election officials and people who care about them need to do the same. While we need to be worried about the impact of outside threats to the election process, I think we need to be focused more on our voters and the information they give us as part of election administration and voting. So what can you do? There's a lot of talk about what can be spent and what you can do, but there are some things you can do right now that really won't cost you much more than a little bit of time. One is to back up any critical data to a place where you can retrieve it if everything else goes wrong, whether it's physical media or some sort of trusted cloud data. You can also use password managers or better password hygiene. There are some places that will allow you to continually change passwords so that critical data is protected. But even just good things like not using other information that can be used against you to protect your passwords is crucial. You know, there's that old saw online that your various things you can, your performer name or something is the name of your first pet and the street you grew up on, and that always results in kind of funny results. But those can also be used to guess at security questions that can then be used to get at your password. So thinking about how you protect your information and what passwords you use to protect your information is crucial. Another one, which is simple to say, but I know is sometimes a time-consuming challenge to do, is to make sure all of your software is up to date. It feels like as our devices and our software multiplies, we're constantly being hit with requests to update software or apply a patch or what have you, and it always seems that those requests come right when you are about to start or finish something that you have been planning to do for quite some time. Despite that, I cannot encourage you enough, and the folks I've talked to in the cybersecurity field cannot encourage you enough to do that. When you get that notification to update Windows or your Apple operating system or whatever your mobile operating system is, take the time to do it. There are people out there who think about cybersecurity constantly. They are basically sending you the free gift of increased peace of mind every time they send you an update. Go ahead and accept that gift and make your technology as secure and up-to-date as it possibly can be. And most important, learn to spot phishing attempts. You can go online, go to your favorite search engine, and enter how to spot phishing attempts, and there are no limit to the number of resources that are out there. I would encourage all of you to ask folks either in your IT office or in other entities you trust if they have trainings or other resources that you can use. Phishers are getting a lot smarter. As I mentioned, it's not just that Nigerian prince anymore. You can get folks who are sending you an email that really does look like it's from your coworker or your bank or a close friend. As hard as it is for someone like me who tends to think well of people, you should essentially trust nothing you get via email or over the internet. And the more likely that the person sending it to you is someone either you trust or need to trust, the more careful you need to be about whether or not you click on that link or give your information to that person. finding out how to spot and ignore phishing attempts really is something you can do right now, starting immediately after this webinar, that will help make you safer in an increasingly unsafe online world. So let's go ahead and talk about the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity. As I mentioned at the outset, we started to hear rumors after Election Day, after there was some back and forth about the relative electoral strength of the candidates, specifically the difference between the electoral vote and the popular vote. There were some tweets and some online chatter about whether or not the popular vote totals could be accepted at face value. From that, we saw increasing discussion about the possibility of a presidential commission. That commission was formally brought into being in May of 2017 by an executive order. It has been staffed with numerous individuals. It's billed as a bipartisan commission, but the membership is definitely more heavily weighted on the side of folks who see fraud as the greatest threat to the American election system. The commission met for the first time yesterday, largely for organizational purposes. They've said they'll have at least 4 more meetings, likely across the country. Seem to have a pretty broad agenda and hunger for data that can be used to analyze the degree to which fraud exists in the American electoral system and whether or not the federal, state, and local governments can do anything about it. So what are going to be some of the key issues with the commission? The first comes from some remarks that the president made immediately at the outset of the commission's first meeting yesterday. In discussing the importance of American elections to the nation's system of democracy, he used the phrase, "one citizen, one vote." And those of you who have worked in elections or know a little bit about election law know that that is reminiscent of the famous phrase, "one person, one vote," or in a less sexist time, "one man, one vote," originally raised in the early reapportionment cases, starting with Baker v. Carr at the Supreme Court. But what the president seems to be doing with his description of the problem as one citizen, one vote is highlighting the threat to the system of non-citizen voting. There is interest in the panel, and there was some discussion yesterday about getting access to data from Homeland Security on non-citizens and using that as a tool to identify the extent to which non-citizens have registered and or voted in American elections. Some questions about whether or not DHS can do so or if that information will have value, but that is definitely going to be a focus of the commission going forward. There's also a tremendous focus on voter registration and voter rolls. Lots of discussion and chatter yesterday about concerns about the growth in both online and automatic voter registration and what it might mean for the integrity of the voting rolls. With that chatter, though, there are significant concerns, including at the state level in many places, about whether or not that focus will somehow tilt the policy field toward one side of the partisan divide as opposed to the other. There are very real concerns about bipartisanship and impartiality with the commission, and you can bet that folks who do believe in online and automatic voter registration and just general expansion of the voter rolls overall are going to be watching the commission very, very closely. And finally, and this has really been the big story over the last several weeks, the commission made a request over the signature of the vice chair, Kansas Secretary Chris Kobach, for state data, which could then be used to conduct various but unspecified research. And that set off quite a reaction across the country. You have many states either outright refusing to make that data available. California, Vermont, I think Connecticut, and others have said they will not provide any state data. Others are limiting it only to what's already publicly available, a shorter data list than what the commission was asking for. This back and forth has actually focused a spotlight on a topic that I don't think a lot of voters realize, which is how much of their voter data is already public. While certain sensitive or personally identifiable information isn't public, simple things like name and address and whether or not you're registered is public in many, if not most states. And that seems to have caught some voters by surprise. They've been taught that the vote is secret, and I think that many of them thought that voter registration data was also secret top to bottom. And so perhaps as a result of that, perhaps it's because some of the partisan debate over access to data, we are seeing a growing and unfortunate phenomenon of voters contacting their state or local election officials and asking to be unregistered as a result of this debate. Remains to be seen how many folks nationwide will ultimately unregister. It was 3,000 or more in Colorado. I haven't seen total nationwide numbers yet. Also heard some anecdotal reports from local election officials that many voters told them that they were going to wait until data was shared with the federal government and then re-register before Election Day. Hopefully that's true, and we'll be curious to see how many of the people who leave the rolls actually come back. But this question of access to data and what kind of data different levels of government, including the commission, will have is going to be an important topic going forward. One other interesting note that I wanted to raise here, which is an unexpected but nonetheless interesting potential for the commission. One of the commissioners is a probate judge in Alabama named Alan King. And for those of you who are not familiar with Alabama election administration, you might be puzzled why a probate judge is on a commission dedicated to election integrity. But it turns out that in Alabama, probate judges are, among other things, election officials. My understanding is that who better to know who's alive and dead in a given community than a probate judge. But Judge King, even though this wasn't included in the call for the commission, and even though it wasn't expected to be a topic, both in his opening remarks and then again and again in the conversation that followed, talked about what he thought was the greatest threat to election integrity in the United States, and that's the lack of funding for election administration at the state and local level. He talked about the technology deficit. He talked about the need to spend money to harden and secure election systems across the country, and said, in essence, and several times verbatim, we need more funding. We need to talk about funding. We need to ask where the money is coming from. And so I'll be curious to see whether or not this commission, which is thought to be focused on significant changes to federal law that might tilt the bar toward increasing protections against fraud, whether or not it might actually also include some push at the federal level for a new infusion of federal dollars, a la Help America Vote Act 2 or something like it. I am never, as I said in my blog this morning, I'm never more than mildly optimistic about what Congress will do in this area, and so I am tempted to bet the under on the amount of money that Congress will make available. But I think there is a possibility, and one worth discussing and watching going forward, about whether or not this new focus on security and fraud and integrity of the election process might result in some federal money from a Congress which has recently been skeptical, if not outright hostile, toward investment in election administration at the federal level. So let me take a break there. Hopefully you all have had an opportunity to think about questions you might have about this or any other topic in the field. I know folks have been submitting them throughout the session. Let me turn it over to my colleague Lee Chittenden, who is going to MC any questions that we have for this session. Lee?
Sorry. Am I on? Okay.
You're on.
All right. One question that came in was, what can states and election officials do to help rebuild the public trust in the election system after all this conversation around hacking and voter fraud?
Excellent question. I think that this is, as hard as it is to have the kind of scrutiny and doubt that the field is facing right now, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for election officials at every level of government to show their work, to essentially open their doors and show voters and the media and the interested public what they do to gather, protect, and use voter information and how they harden and secure their voting equipment. It's tough in the current environment to push back against the negative message, but I think the best thing that election officials can do is use the negative attention that they're currently getting as a way to show everyone involved what they do, how well they do it, and asking for help from voters and encouraging them to be a part of the process, whether as poll workers or by offering other assistance or opportunities for help they might need on or before Election Day. So show your work would be my short answer.
Great. We have another question. Is there any discussion on not keeping all voter data on one computer by the Commission that is prime for hacking, even if officials say it can't happen?
And also a great question, and the subject of a lawsuit currently by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC. I hope I've gotten that. I know I got the acronym right, but there's a lawsuit in federal court saying that there are concerns about all this data being put in a single place. It's not entirely clear on what server this information will be stored by the Commission and who will have access to it. There have been quite a few pleadings back and forth where plaintiffs ask for information and then the judge asks the Commission for responses. It isn't still entirely clear on how that data will be used, but you can bet that there will be significant resistance in the courts to allowing someone who is essentially not an election official to have access to the functional equivalent of a national election database, which is something that most state and local election officials would not want to see as well.
Okay, another question. How can we return to a policy of requiring a paper ballot for every vote in a federal election?
I think that we're starting to, in many ways, we're drifting toward that anyway. I think that with the increasing number of jurisdictions that are requiring audits in some form, and this week we saw the state of Colorado announce that they would be the first to do statewide what are called risk limiting audits. Given how it's very difficult to do a true audit of an election without some kind of physical ballot to review, I think there will be increasing pushes in many states to make paper ballots the default method for casting ballots. Now that still is going to create issues that we need to address with voters with disabilities, whether visual disabilities or other disabilities who, for whom a paper ballot isn't merely inconvenient, but almost a direct bar to casting a secret and independent ballot as required by federal law. But I think that the very strong trend nationwide is toward paper ballots. I think the other factor, and this wasn't addressed in the question, but I think it's worth mentioning here, is that as more and more states rely more and more heavily on ballots sent through the mail or cast either early or absentee, I think there's an increasing focus on paper ballots in the electoral process. The growth of the so-called Colorado model, where every registered voter is sent a ballot and then has the opportunity to return it by mail, return it to a drop box, or bring it to a voter service center either on or before Election Day is going to increase reliance on paper ballots, and that, as much as anything else, may end up driving the trend toward more paper ballots, if not an outright requirement, sometime in the foreseeable future.
Great. Another question here. How can organizational behavior and organizational theory be used in elections and voter registration?
I think my short answer to that is that I would encourage you to take Larry Jacobs' class, because he is much more of a scholar of organizational theory and behavior than I am. I think that said, I think in my course we talk about the tensions between different levels of government, and we have to recognize that different levels of government have different aims, have different revenue bases, and often have different goals in the electoral process. And so thinking about how both governmental and non-governmental organizations seek to advance their goals and essentially negotiate with other organizations about how the election process does and should work is the kind of tool, or at least a tool in the tool belt that every election official ought to have. That's probably not as detailed or succinct an answer as I would have liked, but I do think that election officials need to be open to thinking from lots of different disciplines: design, advocacy, and organizational theory in doing their everyday work.
Okay, do Secretary of States need to examine how they release data when they purge voter rolls to reflect what that info really means? For example, is it possible to be registered at 2 different addresses, but data should show you only voted once?
Well, it is. I think the short answer to the question is yes, and it is, as the question suggests, it is possible to be registered in 2 places. There was a discussion at the meeting yesterday. Secretary Dunlap of Maine talked about students who are registered in their home states but then come to Maine for college or jobs and register to vote in Maine. And while, even though the Maine application requests contact information for the old community, that contact often either isn't made or those voters aren't taken off the rolls in the old community. And yet it should be relatively easy to look at data to determine whether or not a voter actually cast a ballot in more than one place. That actually reminds me, there's another issue that is coming up, will actually be featured in a Supreme Court case this fall. The state of Ohio has a program whereby voters who have not voted in 1 or more elections are contacted to confirm that they still live at the address where they are registered. And if they do not respond, ultimately they are taken off of the rolls. That is in potential conflict with federal law, which says that you cannot be removed from the voter rolls simply for not voting. And so the Supreme Court is going to be asked whether or not non-voting can be a condition which then triggers a request for confirmation, which can then be used to remove a voter from the rolls. The state believes that non-voting is not the reason why voters are being removed from the rolls, but merely a triggering condition. Opponents of the practice believe that non-voting is the reason why they're being removed, and the Supreme Court is being asked to clarify the dispute. However the Supreme Court comes down on that will likely affect how many states deal with non-voting in their own systems. But circling back to the question, I think anytime a state or a community is removing voters from the rolls, that's another opportunity to show their work or be transparent about what the process is for identifying which voters will be removed and why. No one likes to be removed for no reason whatsoever, But even worse is being removed, being told there's a reason, but then not having information as about what that reason is. So I guess this would go back to my earlier admonition that it's an opportunity for election officials at every level to show their work.
Okay, and a question here about the certificate. Can you talk more about the format of the classes?
Certainly. One of the things that we're proudest of with the certificate is that the courses are all completely online. We work with an online course delivery software so that you don't have to travel to Minnesota or anywhere to take the class. Now that said, these are a little different from some of the online courses most of you are familiar with. While students can move at their own pace within units, these courses move week by week through the semester with assignments, writing assignments, discussions, and other projects. So while you don't have to necessarily be in a classroom from 9:30 a.m. to 11:30 every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you do have to keep up with the work as you go forward. As I mentioned, usually there are readings or other materials. There's usually some kind of response to the readings that's required. We also have discussion boards, and students are required usually both to post a response to the discussion prompt and then respond meaningfully, not just me too or I disagree, to at least two of their classmates. And we find that that creates, if not a perfect replication of the classroom experience, it does allow people to build relationships. And one of the things I've been most delightfully surprised by is the way conversations continue to thread throughout the semester. Very often you will find people in week 8 or week 10 referencing back to something that they learned or discussed with one or more classmates in week 2 or 3. And then at the end of the class, there are a variety of grading opportunities, and these are graded courses. There are some courses have exams, some have papers, some have projects. The design course has a final project. So this is intended to replicate the classroom experience without requiring you to actually be in a classroom one or more days a week.
Okay, we had a comment that came in. There was a telephone conference meeting of the Commission on June 28th. This meeting was not open to the public and was not publicized. According to the lawsuit filed by the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Law under page 10, the Commission violates PACEI. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Doug.
Well, that was the subject of a lawsuit, and federal judge, Judge Colleen Kohler-Catelli, I think I got that right, ruled the day before yesterday that she would not issue an injunction against the Commission for failure to comply with the Federal Advisory Committee Act. She left it open for plaintiffs, including the Lawyers Committee, to refile in the future, but at least for the time being, she is allowing the Commission to proceed and not finding that telephonic conversation to be a violation of FACA. That said, I'd be very surprised if plaintiffs don't return to court, and I think you can bet that both transparency generally and compliance with FACA are going to continue to be an issue with this commission going forward.
And our final question here, has there been any documentation that provides validation that there has been widespread voter fraud?
Not to my knowledge. There have been studies. What I tell my students is that it is neither true that voter fraud is rampant nor that it is non-existent. There is a non-zero amount of voter fraud in this country. But right now, based on all available information, it is vanishingly small. It does exist, but not at the level in any community that I think you need to be concerned that voter fraud is affecting, let alone changing, outcomes.
We did have one more comment come in here. It says, non-voting data often indicates the voter has moved. Without doing this type of thing at this point, we could have voters on our books for years and years. Removing non-voting individuals helps us. Any thoughts on that?
That's an argument that you are going to hear from the states, and in fact, several states, and I apologize, I don't have the number in front of me. I want to say 15 states filed what's known as an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in support of the state of Ohio, making precisely that argument, that failure to remove non-voters results in either bloated rolls or excessive deadwood, and that finding ways to identify people who no longer reside at their address, not voting being one of those ways, is a crucial part of updated and clean voter rolls. So it is by no means a slam dunk that non-voting, by no means a slam dunk that Ohio should lose this case. And in fact, the lower court ruled that Ohio should lose the case. And the fact that the Supreme Court took it, there's a saying among the Supreme Court bar that the Supreme Court doesn't grant cert to affirm, that they often take cases because they disagree with the lower court or because they want to clarify the issue. It remains to be seen. The case hasn't been argued. The judges haven't sat down to discuss it. But if you're asking me to bet right now, I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court doesn't clarify or reverse the lower court and say that what Ohio is doing, or some version of it, is okay under federal law. But I've been wrong before and will be several times again, probably today.
All right, that's all for questions on our end.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody one more time for joining us. I know this is a busy time of year, and for many of you, this is your lunch break or your late morning or early afternoon work time. So I want to thank you all for spending some time with us. Just a quick wrap up. This session has been recorded and will be available soon. If you registered, you'll get a notification if you want to come back and listen to the recording again. If you are interested, and we hope that you are, in the certificate in election administration, either the graduate level or undergraduate level, or if you know people in your office or in your community who would be, we are still accepting applications for the fall, and we would love to hear from you. And my email and Lee's email are there. You should absolutely feel free to ask us any questions about the program, how to apply, what's required, tuition and the like. We would be delighted to have you ask those questions because we would be delighted to have you part of our classes in the fall. And so with that, I want to thank everybody for spending the hour with us. I hope you found it as valuable as I did in sharing this information with you, and we hope to see you all again online or out there in the election world very soon. Have a great day, and thank you.